2. Fear spreads in the media like an airborne virus. A woman in a face mask stands with her shopping bags next to a subway. Suddenly she falls forward, landing flat on her face. She lies immobile and stiff on the pavement. A concerned shopkeeper runs out to check on her. A man is out cold in the street, as people in white hazmat suits attend to him. Another man lies face up, body straight, alone in a corridor. Another body, 2 people attending in hazmat suits. A very wide roadblock is manned by people in white lab coats, masks and high-vis vests. Another man lies on his back in a shop. The area is cordoned off. People in PPE look on. These worrying scenes all appear in a video 1 which paints an apocalyptic picture of collapsed citizens, medics in hazmat suits, concerned bystanders and a city grinding to a halt. It was our first glimpse of a new, deadly epidemic and our first taste of fear. It appeared in the British press, specifically the Mail Online, Metro Online and The Sun on 24 January 2020. The video was out at the same time that the first few hundred cases and the first handful of deaths were reported in China and shortly before the first case was confirmed in the UK on 31 January. I remember the video being shared on Twitter and Facebook. I'm not the TikTok or Snapchat generation, but the video also went viral there. Fear is contagious and social media offers the perfect conditions for it to spread. Viruses travel fast by air, but fear travels faster. Share, share, share. One description of the video read, "A particularly dramatic piece of CCTV shows a person wearing a face mask standing on the street, before collapsing to the floor as others rush to help. Watch the video and decide for yourself whether that is a generous, gullible or collusive review. It's striking how set up and fake the scene is. There's even a visible split second when the falling woman falters. Falling flat on your face takes guts and she does a pretty good job, but it still looks like amateur dramatics." Readers' comments ranged from the credulous, truly frightening, to the skeptical, complete set up. Maybe the journalists also suspected the video was set up, but the lure of clickbait was too great. Journalists should verify their sources. Was this video verified? I contacted the journalists who wrote the articles about the video for the Mail Online, The Sun and the Metro to ask about its provenance, and what they had done to check its authenticity. None of them replied. Another disturbing video showed people in China being dragged from their homes by officials in hazmat suits. Had they refused to quarantine? Were they knowingly infecting people? The video tells us that the Chinese government had started doing door-to-door temperature checks. Were these people being taken because they had a high temperature? Is the whole thing real or fake? We have no idea, yet the video will have played its part in stimulating fear. Headlines referred to zombies, killer bug, and apocalypse. Over and over, these Chinese COVID videos were described as disturbing by newspapers and commentators. Horror film and end-of-days references seeped through. A Sun headline, Zombieland, traveled with the speed of a virulent sneeze through the copycat global media. In 2020 we learned that fear sells better than sex. If it scares, it airs. If it bleeds, it leads. Finally, the obsession with women's physical charms took a backseat, but maybe because it was carjacked by fear porn. I could almost reminisce about the days of quaint media sexism and objectification. Oh, if all we had to worry about was a celebrity upskirt shot, or bare boobs in the sun, rather than daily death tolls. Some news outlets and commentators wondered if these videos were proof that China was hiding how bad the situation was, rather than exaggerating it. But how plausible were they? The epidemic never transpired to look like this. People haven't suddenly fallen flat on their faces, to be immediately surrounded by hazmat-suited medics anywhere except these videos. They depicted a totally overblown horror story vision of COVID-19. If the rest of the world had COVID, China appears to have had stunt COVID. The videos were shared many millions of times, but it's impossible to quantify now, as in some cases they have been removed, including the probable first sources on Chinese social media sites such as Weibo and TikTok. The videos originated in China. Were they a prank or were they a psyop, a covert psychological operation? The fact-checking website Snopes investigated the source of the videos and couldn't find them before the event they supposedly showed, so they might be from January 2020 and that's all we know. Whether they were plausible, prank or psyop, the videos planted the seed of an idea that the virus had terrifying consequences. They also, at least inadvertently, seeded the idea of a very strong medical and authoritarian response. There will be more on the importance of seeding in Chapter 7, The Tools of the Trade. If you don't remember the videos, or didn't watch them, I do urge you to view them to compare this early glimpse of stunt COVID with what actually transpired. This book focuses on the UK state, COVID and fear, and this chapter is about the UK's media and social media, but it's relevant to mention another Chinese influence before continuing. While I don't wish to plunge you into the murky waters of anything that could be labeled conspiracy theory so early in our journey into fear, the fact is the COVID stunt videos might suggest an attempt to create fear, and there is yet another reason to suspect deliberate spreading of misinformation. It is difficult to ascertain the extent of undercover social media propaganda, but a 2017 study how the Chinese government fabricates social media posts for strategic distraction, not engaged Argument 2 estimated that from 250,000 to 2 million Chinese people are hired by their government to post approximately 448 million faked social media posts per year. These undercover pro-government commentators set out to be ordinary citizens as they steer conversations in the correct direction for the Chinese Communist Party. They are referred to as the 50C Army, as they are reportedly paid 50C per post. ProPublica 3 analyzed fake and hijacked Twitter accounts and found more than 10,000 suspected fake Twitter accounts pushing propaganda about Hong Kong. Accounts then switched their focus from Hong Kong to COVID-19. These tweets were not aimed at the Chinese living in China, as Twitter is blocked by the Great Firewall. Some were in Chinese and aimed at ethnic Chinese living overseas, but many of the tweets were in English. They were aimed at us. And they waged an unofficial PR campaign in support of the Chinese government's handling of COVID. Fake Twitter accounts, including bots, unleashed pro-China propaganda when Italy locked down. Italy was the first European country to sign up to China's Belt and Road Initiative, a global trade, infrastructure and cultural network, generally considered to be a way to extend China's economic and political influence. China's medical aid to Italy was described as a «health Silk Road» by President Xi Jinping. Twitter was flooded with #Forza Sani Italia, Go China, Go Italy, and #Grazie Cina, Thank You China. These hashtagged messages of support are thought to be from Chinese social media propagandists, the 50C Army, not genuine Italian citizens. Is it a coincidence that Italy was the first country in Europe to lock down? And that this followed Italy and China's trade and development agreement? Did this social media campaign influence the public and the politicians? Michael P. Senger wrote for the Tablet 4 about China's online propaganda campaign. He noticed that these 50C Army Twitter users were going a step further, taking a darker turn by criticizing U.S. governors who did not issue statewide lockdowns, deliberately trying to influence U.S. policy. On the 11th of March 2020, in an interview with the BBC, David Halpern, head of the UK's Behavioural Insight team, talked about the plan to cocoon the elderly until herd immunity had been acquired. 5 The concept of herd immunity is well established in science and had not been considered controversial until that point. Interestingly, by the 13th of March Chinese state-affiliated Twitter accounts were criticizing the approach. Sweden will not test people with mild symptoms. UK and Germany tried to build a herd immunity, which will expose many people to the risk of death. These countries are unwilling to invest more resources in epidemic control. What about human rights? What about humanitarianism? 6. This is rich from the country that literally welded people into their homes and instigated a brutal and experimental lockdown. And that's without getting started on wider human rights violations, such as the internment of Uyghur people in Xinjiang. As a Chinese satirical song that also did the rounds on social media goes, after brainwashing, wash your hands and your face. Some things naturally proliferate on social media, they go viral. Fear is one of those things. In 2020 it was given wings. Understanding who helped it fly, how and why should be of immense concern to our government and to all of us. Other countries mimicked China's lockdown. Confusingly, the World Health Organization didn't recommend lockdowns, yet at the same time lauded China's approach. The West was largely horrified by footage of Wuhan residents trapped in their homes, yet we enacted a similar totalitarian policy. The Sun reported that devastating footage appears to show coronavirus patients being welded inside their homes and left to die as China battles to contain the fatal disease. Point 7. The newspapers which shared Chinese videos without verifying their authenticity lacked journalistic rigor. What followed throughout 2020 and into 2021 was an incessant onslaught of doom-mongering through TVs, newspapers, radio and the Internet. In the rest of this chapter I will look at the reasons why the UK media might have reported the epidemic in the way it did. The constant COVID news and daily death tolls meant they dominated our thoughts. In all likelihood, COVID, death, lockdown and the effects of restrictions have been your brain's main go-tos. The availability heuristic, or availability bias, describes a mental shortcut which means that we recall the most immediate examples of things. When a matter is extremely pressing, it crowds out our ability to think of other things. If COVID deaths are talked about every day, then you think about them every day, at the expense of other types of deaths, but also at the expense of much of life. Our cognitive roadmap was redrawn in 2020. You may have been driving, but the government and media had control of your satnav. The media has a responsibility to inform us, but it also has a responsibility to be balanced. The coverage of daily death tolls, the ghoulish headlines and the scary graphs, permeated our brains. Some of the people I have interviewed told me about the considerable effect that the media had on their perception of the world and their subsequent mental well-being. The media should serve the public trust and owes its readers and viewers the best available version of the truth, ascertained by careful questioning. The British public expect the highest standards from the BBC, which is probably why it hurt so much that it spread alarm, exemplified by Sarah's mother, P37. Of all the news providers, it is the BBC we would most expect to take a careful step back from the furore and fear and offer a balanced perspective. I talked to former BBC journalist Sue Cook. She told me she had been surprised and disappointed by the BBC's one-sided coverage of COVID, and the lack of vigorous questioning. A lifetime listener, she even turned off Radio 4 this year because she couldn't bear to listen to it anymore. For such a BBC stalwart, it was a bitter discovery that the BBC's standards of truth and impartiality have gone. She said, "My fear is that there is now no solid, consistent media outlet you can trust. You have to cast around and find people you can trust. It might be someone on Facebook or YouTube, and it's a jungle out there." The BBC has a charter which promises to provide impartial news and information to help people understand and engage with the world around them. In the BBC's guidelines on the use of language, there are specific undertakings in times of terror, war and disaster. One promise is that care is required in the use of language that carries value judgments. Point 8. Some of the BBC's coverage of COVID sits a little uneasily with its charter, although some welcomed the value judgments. BBC Newsnight presenter Emily Maitlis received both praise and criticism from different quarters for her editorializing when she criticized Dominic Cummings on 26 May for breaking the rules. There were 24,000 complaints to the BBC, which agreed she had breached impartiality guidelines. The BBC appeared to highlight stories which would create fear, focusing on negative outcomes rather than recovery. One headline read, "Luton teen speaks of really scary time her dad caught virus." Another read, "I had my funeral planned in my head. Italian economy takes a body blow," is a subtle example of a BBC headline on 1 March 2020 which was less impartial than we might expect. Body blow is a metaphor that conjures a painful impact on the economy. Rather than leading with a fact about the drop in GDP, or the prediction of recession, this headline is a more colorful, editorialized headline. I asked Cook her opinion. The term body blow is acceptable if it describes a literal fact, but not to dramatize and exaggerate. That's wrong. The BBC's coverage was so remarkably fear-mongering during the epidemic that in January 2021 Telegraph journalist Alison Pearson labeled the organization the Body Bag Corporation. Point 9. I deliberately chose a subtle illustration here because it's easily forgiven. The issue is it wasn't an isolated example, it was one of hundreds of dramatized headlines about a single virus. They all add up to create a more powerful impression. Among a wealth of other articles about the epidemic in Italy, this headline created a feeling of doom-mongering. According to Cook, all the examples from Italy dramatize things to sound important and make people sit up and listen. I wonder whether the content is less important than the dramatic impact. Ultimately, it's destructive of trust. I asked the BBC journalist who wrote the story about this choice of headline and for a wider discussion about the BBC's COVID coverage, but he declined to answer. Sky News reported on 19 March 2020 that army vehicles were brought in to transport dead bodies in Bergamo. This would make you think that army trucks were needed because there were so many bodies. In fact, according to the Italian Funeral Industry Federation, 70% of undertakers had to stop work to quarantine at the start of the outbreak, so the army was drafted in for a one-off transport of 60 coffins. The startling image of the army transporting the dead was not explained, but it appeared on Sky and other broadcasters and in newspapers here in the UK and around the world, seeding the idea of an almost unmanageable number of corpses. One reason that the same stories proliferate globally, and that sources are not always thoroughly fact-checked by news outlets, is the reliance on news agencies. There are three main global news agencies: Associated Press, Reuters and Agence France Presse. Much of the text, images and video you see in broadcast and print has come from those three agencies. This means there is far less diversity in reporting than you might think, especially on foreign news. If one of the big three agencies doesn't report on it, as far as most of the Western media goes, it didn't happen. And agency reporting of geopolitical stories can be subtly deduced from a similarity in tone, as well as the same images and sometimes text. Journalists are human and subject to the same fears as the rest of us. We are all made of the same psychological stuff. Perhaps their fears clouded their judgment and reporting. They might not have had time, in the teeth of the crisis, to thoroughly investigate every image and video supplied by the picture desk. Yet the result was weeks and months of relentlessly emotional bad news that lacked context and rigor. How did the relentless fear in the media affect politicians? They also read the news and live with the same cultural wallpaper, so they are not immune to the effects. In an interesting insight, Matt Hancock, the Minister for Health, revealed in an interview 11 on LBC Radio in 2021 that he had placed large orders for COVID vaccines as a result of watching the fictional film Contagion. This seems to have turned out well for our vaccine supplies, but it's a remarkable admission about the influence of a sensationalist Hollywood film about a fictional virus that kills 30% of people who catch it on the health secretary. Fear and time are two factors that might explain the fear-mongering, but there are two more. I asked a broadsheet comment writer why newspapers used so many doom-laden headlines. Narcissism and greed drive this, he said. Pay rises are linked to the top-performing articles. The journalists who get the highest views for articles and the most subscriptions generated for the paper get the biggest pay rises. You want your stories to get the most views. I asked him for an example. When Sage came out with the prediction of 500,000 deaths, the newspaper instantly published it to get the headline out immediately, rather than interrogate it. Within 5 minutes it's out there as a headline. Then a few hours later there's a more skeptical article. But the first story has had the impact, not the skeptical one. When Whitty and Valance predicted 4,000 deaths a day in October, we knew straight away that would be the headline. But a good journalist should say, this doesn't pass the sniff test. They should research it and not publish it verbatim. Sure, a couple of days later there's an article dissecting the numbers, but it doesn't get the same take-up as the first story. The article gets the views. The journalist gets the pay rise. We have panic. The damage is done. Not all journalists fed us a constant diet of fear. Like Sue Cook, I also regretfully switched off Radio 4. I found talk radio, which had a broader variety of guests. Talk radio presenter Dan Wooden's motto in 2020 was, no spin, no bias and no hysteria. I spoke to him about his approach on his radio show and also his column in The Sun. Wooden had COVID at the same time as Boris Johnson, meaning he understood it could be a seriously unpleasant illness, but from the beginning he didn't agree lockdown was the right policy economically, socially or in terms of other health costs. He said he thought that on the day the Office for National Statistics revealed that there had been 26,000 non-COVID excess deaths between March and September in homes, 12 the media would get it and balance the harms and costs of lockdown. It was close to the COVID death toll at the time. It got some coverage in the newspapers, but I remember the news bulletins didn't do it. The reporting has been focused on COVID deaths and the consequences of lockdown have been ignored. I asked why he thought that was. I think there is a groupthink mentality. If the BBC covers a story, then ITV and Channel 4 do it too. A lot of journalists will take the easy option. A broadcast journalist who spoke to me off the record said that most people on her editorial team had a different perspective on the epidemic to her. She described herself as fighting the good fight in the newsroom, but being outnumbered by her team. Maybe they had consumed the information provided by the government more uncritically than this journalist. It was a crusade for her to push for balance, such as for statistics on recoveries to be given alongside deaths, more detailed breakdowns about ICU occupancy in hospitals and PCR false positives. The number 10 press briefings were characterized by bland and unchallenging questions from journalists, such as when will the epidemic be over? A Press Gazette reader poll 13 concurred. When it asked, do you think journalists have done a good job of holding the government to account during the daily UK COVID-19 press briefings? 70% said no. Weak questions fail to hold politicians to account, fail to uncover essential information which should be in the public domain, fail to provide balance which would settle minds and emotions, and they also damage journalism itself. Another Press Gazette poll 14 showed that public trust in journalists had been eroded. When asked, do you think trust in journalism has increased since the COVID-19 epidemic? 48% said no and 19% said it had remained the same. Only 33% said it had increased. Another survey 15 conducted by Edelman's Trust found that, globally, journalists were the least trusted source for coronavirus updates. In general, mainstream journalists only discussed the epidemic and the lockdown within the framework set by lockdown, they didn't investigate and interrogate from outside the framework. Where journalists provided challenge, the default position was to perform outrage at every opportunity and to play at unelected opposition, but always in the one direction, demanding the government go further, and lock down sooner and harder. Close businesses? Now schools. Tier 3. Why not Tier 4? Perhaps journalists have come to see themselves more as political activists holding populist Johnson to account, in a simplistic morality play of pandemic deaths versus evil Tory politics. Of course, the political and health journalists employed by newspapers, TV and radio had secure jobs throughout the crisis. If they had suffered financially in the same way as the millions of self-employed, or those in hard-hit sectors such as hospitality and leisure, would they have provided more challenge? Why else haven't journalists asked more challenging questions? There is a complex relationship between the government, the media and the public. Noam Chomsky explained the propaganda model of mass media, in his book, Manufacturing Consent. One aspect of this is that the proximity of mass media to political and economic power means that the media propagate the world views of the powerful. One simple way this works is that newspapers and broadcasters have to cater to the financial motivations of their owners and investors. Proprietors have a top-down effect on the preferences and biases of the media. Boris Johnson was a popular leader at the start of the crisis, and so newspapers might have been sympathetic. Put simply, if Rupert Murdoch liked Boris Johnson at the beginning of 2020, a News UK media brand would be more likely to write supportive articles. Piers Morgan offers a marvelous example of someone who was supported by the media. He was a vociferous supporter of lockdown, and critical of people who broke the rules or appeared to minimize the dangers of the epidemic on Good Morning Britain and through his Twitter account. On 16 December he urged the government to introduce tougher restrictions for Christmas. Yet he went to the Caribbean island of Antigua for his Christmas break. This didn't break the law, but it did breach guidance, and was contrary to his strong words to the nation and cabinet ministers. You might call it hypocritical. Guido Fox 16 broke the story, which was not picked up by the newspapers. Politicians and celebrities who broke the rules were castigated by the media. Piers Morgan is friends with editors and a powerful figure in the media. Did they form a silent circle of protection around him? I spoke to a seasoned investigative journalist from one of the broadsheets about the challenges in political journalism. There is a symbiotic relationship between government and journalists that can, uncomfortably, provide government with the means to partially set the agenda. Firstly, beyond official press briefings, government press officers and SPADs, special advisors to politicians, give favored information and informal briefings to political journalists. If the journalist writes things the government doesn't like, the journalist is less likely to be kept in the loop. So to an extent, they are under pressure to write about what they are told, if they want to maintain a preferential relationship. Secondly, if information is fed to the journalist late in the day, there isn't always time to thoroughly investigate before it runs. If it's a cracking story, it may be published quite uncritically in order to get the scoop. The investigative journalist acknowledged that fear is a good story. It's easy for the media to go full throttle into scare mode. Fear engages the reader. That has a short-term positive benefit for the news outlet, but ultimately it disrupts the delicate balance between public, government and media. The longer lockdowns and restrictions go on, the more advertising and sales revenues suffer. Are we now at the stage where that will, finally, drive a change in tone in the media? There were certainly times when the relationship between the government and the media looked very cozy. The media enthusiastically covered stories which supported the government position, but ignored stories which might harm it. For example, 2 studies were released in a short space of time about the immune response to COVID, one negative about long-term immunity and one positive. Guess which one received the most coverage? The BBC reported on the negative study, which showed antibodies fall after a COVID infection, on 27 October 2017 and said, immunity appears to be fading and there is a risk of catching the virus multiple times. However, in November it did not report on a study 18 showing that a quarter of us might have T-cell immunity to COVID, which is long-lasting. Low-quality evidence in favor of masks was all over the media, but the one decent randomized controlled trial, RCT, into mask wearing was barely reported. It found a statistically insignificant difference in infection between mask wearers and non-mask wearers. 19 I interviewed one of the study's authors for Chapter 13, The Climate of Fear. Hospital admissions made headlines, but not discharges. Deaths were reported with grim daily dedication, but not recoveries. Is it any wonder that the UK was one of the most frightened countries in the world? Professor Sir David Spiegelhalter, the head of the University of Cambridge's Winton Centre for Risk and Evidence Communication, which carried out a study into British attitudes, said he was concerned that the UK had become overanxious. Most news outlets rely on advertising revenue for income, which means there is a degree of unspoken catering to the preferences of the advertiser. There was a 48% decline in traditional advertising spend in the UK in the lockdown period 23 March to 30 June. Public Health England became the UK's largest advertiser, and the government the 6th biggest advertiser, during this time. The Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, announced in April 2020 that the UK would spend £35 million on the all-in, altogether advertising campaign in national and regional newspapers. Did that set the tone for editorial coverage at the outset of the epidemic? Campaign reported that Cabinet Office figures reveal that the government invested in excess of £184 million on communications relating to COVID-19 in 2020.21. What will the final bill be? And do the newspapers dare to bite the hand that feeds them? As well as editor and proprietor bias, the influence of advertising revenue, the lure of the clickbait headline and the journalist's own tendency to feel the fear and allow that to influence reporting, another worrying factor affected media coverage of the epidemic. On 23 April 2020, Ofcom, the UK's communication regulator, issued strict guidance about COVID coverage. It asked broadcasters to be alert to health claims related to the virus which may be harmful, medical advice which may be harmful, accuracy or material misleadingness in programs in relation to the virus or public policy regarding it. 22. That guidance could be interpreted as not permitting anyone to challenge the government's public health policy. Scientific advice evolves, so does government advice, and inhibiting broadcasters from these discussions is dangerous. Free speech is not just for the good times, it's for epidemics too. In fact, it is in times of crisis that we need to hold these values even closer. As the Free Speech Union pointed out, broadcasters should be able to air different views without Ofcom making value judgments. The approach adopted by Ofcom in these cases is deeply concerning. It is true, as Ofcom notes, that this is a time of significantly heightened public sensitivity. It is also a time of substantially increased state powers and restrictions on long-established liberties. However, no such restrictions have been placed by the government on the right to free speech. In fact, it is vital that this right should be upheld so that the government's decision to impose wide-ranging restrictions can be challenged by broadcasters and others. This means that any regulator charged with upholding freedom of expression, as is the case with Ofcom, should proceed to restrict that freedom only on a closely reasoned basis. That is something Ofcom has manifestly failed to do. 23. Ofcom's decision may have chilled the inclination of the media to explore theories which were counter to government advice. The state broadcaster, the BBC, refused to challenge state orthodoxy, which is the sort of thing we criticize other countries for. Open debate should have been allowed, in sensible and contextual ways, to inform the public, stimulate scientific debate and acknowledge that consensus moves. There is a word for only sharing information which is biased and is used to promote a political cause: propaganda.